Cleveland was not supposed to be the story this week. I had other teams queued up, other conversations I was already deep inside, and honestly, the Browns have spent so much of the past 2 years submerged under the Deshaun Watson situation and the gravitational pull of everything orbiting it that I had mentally filed them under teams I'd get back to once the more urgent material cleared. That was the plan. Then I sat down with the minicamp footage. And something happened that I want to be precise about because it does not happen often when I'm grinding through early off-season clips from a dozen different facilities. I stopped mid-rep, rewound, watched it again. Then I pushed everything else aside and spent the next 2 hours on nothing but Cleveland. Not because a single play demanded it, because the accumulation of details across those sessions created an impression that I could not dismiss or set aside, which was that this was not the carefully packaged promotional content that organizations release to feed their media cycle. This was something being genuinely assembled, something with internal organizational logic and coherent intention running beneath the surface of individual player moments. And when I finished, I was sitting with a thought I had not arrived at the session expecting to have. The most important story developing in the AFC North right now might not be in Baltimore. It might not be in Cincinnati. It might be in Berea, Ohio, being written one practice rep at a time. Let me tell you precisely what I saw. Before anything else, I want to establish the correct interpretive frame, because I think most coverage of minicamp footage gets the epistemology wrong in one of two directions. Either it inflates controlled walkthroughs into definitive NFL readiness evaluations, or it dismisses them as meaningless content filler not worth serious analytical attention. Both responses miss the actual point. Helmets and shorts, no live pass rush, no defensive back competing for his roster spot with the kind of authentic desperation that genuinely tests a receiver's concentration at the top of a route when his hands matter most. The competitive pressure is present but managed, controlled in ways that August training camp will absolutely not replicate. Anyone handing you firm conclusions about NFL readiness from 3 days of padless walkthroughs is offering you something that the setting fundamentally cannot produce. That part is true. But here is what minicamp does reveal with unusual honesty. It exposes the invisible work. The months of private preparation built in empty facilities before any camera was running. That kind of preparation announces itself on day one with a clarity that is almost impossible to hide, regardless of how controlled the environment is, because genuine readiness is visible in the first rep and in every rep after it. In Cleveland this week, it was visible in ways that I could not stop watching. Let me start with Denzel Boston, because I think the gap between what the footage actually showed and what most national coverage has allocated him analytically is wide enough to constitute a genuine problem worth correcting. The physical profile hits you immediately. Long, large, occupying the outside receiver position with a kind of imposing physical authority that this Cleveland offense has been quietly missing for a period long enough that most observers have stopped registering the absence as a structural limitation. It has just become ambient noise, an accepted ceiling on what this offense can be, rather than an identifiable problem with an identifiable solution. The Josh Gordon comparisons appeared almost immediately after the first clip circulated, and I understand the instinct. A boundary receiver who physically commands routes rather than simply running them. A perimeter target who forces defensive coordinators to commit real coverage resources rather than allowing them to settle into comfortable reactive postures against a receiver they do not genuinely fear. That specific presence has been absent from this offense's architecture for years, and Boston's physical profile addresses it in a way that deserves direct acknowledgement. But I need you to stay with me here, because the physical description is not the story, and I will not allow this evaluation to be reduced to a size accounting. The routes are the story. What Boston demonstrated in his route running during those minicamp sessions is being discussed in a single sentence across most of the coverage I've seen, and it deserves considerably more than that. He was not winning in those competitive periods on raw physical advantage. He was not using his frame to manufacture separation the way a player still learning what the position fundamentally demands would approach the problem. What he was showing, at an early developmental stage where his technical construction is still clearly in progress, was root intelligence that has no business being that developed this early in a professional career. He was creating positional leverage before his breaks rather than scrambling to recover it after a defensive back had already processed his movement. He was establishing tendencies in his release patterns during the early portions of a session, and then executing cuts that directly contradicted what he had been showing coverage all morning. He was making pre-snap reads and in-route adjustments that mark the real dividing line between a receiver who has genuinely internalized what professional football demands and an athletic profile still in the early stages of discovering what the position actually is. Route sophistication at that level does not appear at a professional evaluation, having been installed across 3 days of coaching sessions, while staff are still memorizing names. It gets constructed through months of deliberate private work, empty training facilities, individual coaching relationships built and maintained through the entire offseason, repetition after repetition in settings where nothing is being filmed, and nothing is being rewarded except the player's own honest accounting of what his opportunity requires. Boston walked into Cleveland with that construction complete and legible, the way that genuine preparation is always legible on day one, because it cannot conceal itself regardless of how structured the environment is. For Shedeur Sanders, the operational implications are concrete. The most persistent structural constraint on this offense has been the absence of a perimeter receiver who commands enough defensive respect to force genuine coverage commitment on the outside. The kind of commitment that creates downstream space in the intermediate zones where a quarterback's precision and willingness to attack tight windows can be maximized. Boston's combination of physical presence and the root intelligence he arrived with creates a coverage problem. This offense has not been capable of generating for a considerable amount of time. Now, Concepcion, and I want to give you both sides of this completely, because the version that flatters the narrative and the version that serves your actual understanding of this player are genuinely different conversations, and I am only interested in the second one. The drops were a real and significant problem. I am not going to contextualize them away with minicamp caveats, because drops in professional football are not simply statistical negatives that reset between snaps like a video game counter. They are psychological events with operational consequences that extend throughout an entire working relationship. Every uncaught catchable ball introduces friction between a quarterback and a receiver. Friction that does not dissolve automatically, that quietly shapes how play calling develops over the course of a season, that slowly erodes the specific operational trust a quarterback must carry in a target to commit to throwing him the football when the coverage is genuine and the outcome of the game is on the line. Concepcion's hands must become reliably better. That is the central developmental challenge sitting directly in front of him, and anything less clear than that statement is a disservice to the honest evaluation. But reducing the entire Concepcion picture to the drops conversation is its own analytical failure, and I will not do it. The root tape demands a separate accounting, and it is a genuinely different accounting from the hands issue. The way he was already processing his releases off the line of scrimmage. The movement concepts being applied through the stems of his roots before his breaks arrived. The sharpness he was generating at the top of his cuts. Real quickness, not telegraphed athleticism that a defensive back can read in time. There was a touchdown connection in those sessions where separation happened because the root concept functioned correctly against the coverage he had read pre-snap, not because his athleticism outpaced his defender. That distinction carries enormous weight in projecting a professional ceiling. A receiver who gets open because the route worked correctly is making a fundamentally different statement about himself than a receiver who gets open because he is faster than the man covering him. The first demonstrates football intelligence developing at real pace. The second demonstrates athleticism. Concepcion's minicamp fell consistently and clearly into the first category. His feet are already doing things that give a coaching staff genuine developmental material. The hands have to catch up with everything else. That is the work ahead. But work built on top of a real technical foundation is a different and more promising situation than drops sitting on top of nothing, and that distinction matters enormously in projecting what this player becomes. Taran Green. I want to address this directly and plainly before the narrative building around certain corners of his minicamp moments gains momentum the evidence has not earned. The arm talent is legitimate. The mobility dimension he brings is real in a way a traditional pocket passer structurally cannot replicate. The physical presence he projected in those early sessions generated genuine excitement that deserves acknowledgement without qualification or condescension. And alongside all of that, because holding both things simultaneously is what honest evaluation requires, the mechanical release carries a length and looseness that will demand sustained and patient refinement before it holds up consistently against live professional pass rush. He overthrew a tight end. He sailed throws past their intended targets across multiple separate reps. None of this is surprising given the context, and none of it should generate alarm. Green was a sixth-round selection specifically because the ceiling is attached to a developmental timeline measured in years, not months, and his current floor is precisely where sixth-round developmental quarterbacks tend to stand at the beginning of their professional lives. I want to be direct here because I can feel where certain coverage spaces are trying to take these mini-camp moments, and it needs to be addressed without softening. An encouraging throw in a no-contact walkthrough setting does not reopen any meaningful conversation about the starting quarterback position on this football team. Not slightly, not in any meaningful direction. Green's physical toolkit is genuinely interesting, and his development as a backup option over time may produce something worth monitoring. But a sixth-round developmental player still in the early process of translating raw physical gifts into consistent professional execution is not entering any legitimate conversation about the starting role on a franchise that has committed its entire organizational identity and the resource decisions that express that identity toward a different quarterback. Shedeur Sanders is who Cleveland is constructing this offense around. That conclusion is not a talking point. It is encoded in every significant decision this organization has made since the offseason began. One promising padless rep does not touch a single element of that architecture. Full stop. Now here is where I want to spend real time, because this is the largest actual story coming out of Cleveland minicamp and the least likely to receive the serious attention it deserves in national coverage. Stop looking at the individual pieces for a moment. Look at the organizational logic that runs underneath all of them and connects them into something coherent. Because when you step back far enough to see the construction as a whole rather than as a collection of separate player evaluations, something becomes visible that individual assessments cannot capture. Boston directly addresses the boundary receiver absence that has quietly constrained this offense's ceiling for years, not as a projection built on physical potential, but as an identifiable profile arriving with preparation work already clearly completed and visible. Concepcion's movement, qualities, and route processing sophistication create coverage allocation pressure in the intermediate zones that generate operating space specifically where Shedeur has demonstrated the most comfort and the most precision. The rebuilt offensive line represents hundreds of millions of dollars invested deliberately toward creating the protective infrastructure a franchise quarterback needs to actually operate at his talent ceiling, rather than at the compromised survival level that an unstable front five forces onto a quarterback regardless of his ability. These are not opportunistic acquisitions, dropped into available depth chart slots and held together by scheme hope. They are specific, deliberate investments in an offensive vision drawn around a particular quarterback's particular qualities, resourced with the seriousness of an organization that believes in what it is building with real conviction. That is what intentional franchise construction looks like when it is actually happening, and it is a categorically different process from the transactional roster assembly that teams stuck in perpetual transition tend to produce. Pieces gathered when available, scheme applied on top hoping for coherence, organizational identity rebuilt from scratch every 2 or 3 years. Cleveland right now does not look like an organization reacting to its circumstances. It looks like one executing a plan drawn up long before minicamp week, with the pieces arriving at this evaluation reflecting that intention at a level of specificity that is difficult to dismiss. The culture visible inside these sessions carries its own significance, and I think it deserves explicit treatment rather than being left as subtext. The earliest days of a rookie minicamp are efficient at revealing one specific thing with unusual clarity: who arrived with their preparation already embedded in their technique, and who showed up expecting to construct a first impression in real time while the evaluation was already running. Boston's root intelligence on day 1 was not installed by a Cleveland coaching staff in 3 days of walkthroughs. It was built over months of individual work in facilities where nothing was being documented and nobody was watching except the player himself, sustained entirely by his own reckoning with what this professional opportunity demanded. Concepcion's movement sophistication tells the same story about the same fundamental off-season choice. These are players who treated the period between draft night and reporting date as a genuine competitive window rather than a calendar gap. That choice is visible immediately and unmistakably on film to anyone who has watched enough football to recognize the difference between a player who arrived prepared and a talented player who arrived confident that talent alone would be sufficient. The Watson situation has consumed its own oxygen long enough, and its conclusion is already visible to anyone watching with genuine honesty. The trade speculation cycles on a media schedule that appears detached from any supporting evidence. The Taran Green storyline that certain segments of coverage want to elevate past what the evaluation actually shows is not the real story coming out of Berea this week. The real story is on that practice field, being written rep by receivers who showed up with preparation visible in their very first routes, by rookies competing with the urgency of players who understand precisely what is at stake and what is not going to be handed to anyone, and by a coaching staff assembling an offense with deliberate architectural intention around a quarterback whose specific qualities those construction decisions are designed to serve and maximize. Not another transitional year managing expectations downward toward mediocrity. Not another patience cycle, while the real competitive window stays perpetually just out of reach. A foundation being built with specific intention and the investment to back that intention with real organizational resources. The assembly is further along and moving faster than the national conversation has registered. Something genuine is being built in Cleveland. And when October arrives and people are trying to explain what they're watching, the answer will have been sitting in this minicamp footage the entire time, waiting for whoever stopped long enough to actually see it clearly.